Hello, and welcome to Meet the Music. I'm your host, Thomas Corley. Thank you for listening and joining our musical journey. As we continue to explore our series and uniqueness of many sounds of African American music genres, this episode features the R&B music genre. Joining me for insight is Dr. Mark Anthony Neal. Dr. Neal is the James B. Duke Distinguished Professor of African and African American Studies and the Chair of the Department of African and African American Studies at Duke University. He is also faculty affiliations at Trinity College. Duke University website is a source for all courses offered. Dr. Neal's research areas and teaching interests are Black popular culture, Black masculinity, sexism, homophobia in Black communities, and the history of Black popular music. He is the author of many books, several here that I'm going to mention. What the Music Said, Soul Babies, Songs in the Key of Black Life, A Rhythm and Blues Nation, which I think will be the source of our conversation today. And he has numerous other books on shelves. We will have a link to his Amazon page here at the end of the episode in our description section. Dr. Neal is the recipient of the 2010 Robert B. Cox Award for Teaching. Dr. Neal is the host of video webcast Left of Black. I highly recommend you go check that out. He is the founder and managing editor of the blog New Black Man at newblackmeninexile.net. Okay, so when you are done listening to this episode, I want you to go to YouTube, go down the rabbit hole, and watch a few of his interviews on Left to Black with Dr. Neal. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button. After stalking Dr. Neal on the internet, there doesn't appear to be a lot of evidence showing him as the interviewee. I no doubt want to thank Dr. Neal as 1,000 times for accepting our invitation. Dr. Mark Anthony Neal, welcome to Meet the Music.
Oh, I'm glad to be here, Thomas. Thank you.
Yeah. So I generally ask my guests, how did they get the music into their headspace? But, I mean, because you and I are both African-American, that's a kind of an obvious question. So why don't we just go ahead and jump into the historical aspects of the chronological order of how R&B fits into our landscape.
Yeah, so I'm a bit of a purist when we talk about rhythm and blues. I trace rhythm and blues back to the actual phrase, rhythm and blues, the music of Louis Jordan in the late 1940s. The sound that predates what we come to now refer to as rock and roll was in fact rhythm and blues music. And there's a way that when we think about the 1960s and that high point of what we think of as soul music, some of that is soul music and some of that is still traditional rhythm and blues. Ike and Tina Turner are doing rhythm and blues music. I would argue that Motown was more rhythm and blues than soul, in that context, right? Because when we think about soul, we're actually thinking more about the gospel influence. We're thinking about Southern soul when we think about Stax and things like that. But that thing that we call R&B, where the rhythm and the blues part of it is left out, that's something that I trace back to the late 1970s and in the early 1980s. This period after the high point of soul music and where Black music, soul music kind of gets smoothed out, if you will. You think about the great music of Philadelphia International Records, Gamble and Huff, even the stuff that Tom Bell is doing them as part of Mighty Three Publishing. It is a kind of smoothed out sound, right? That is the entry point into what we think about as R&B music. So in the 1980s, when we get to Rick James, even though obviously they're funk influences, but definitely figures like Luther Vandross and Cheryl Lynn and Stephanie Mills's career in that period of time, Evelyn Champagne King, that's in the sweet spot of what we think of as R&B music.
I appreciate that roll call. So, your writings, I mean, there's so much out there, and I went down the rabbit hole on a couple of your interviews with others, and then you kind of, had the conversation back and forth about your writings. But tell me, what was the spark to do that one, The Key of Life, or Black Life?
I had started writing for a website called Pop Matters. Pop Matters launched in 1999. The very first piece I did for them was a review of D'Angelo's Voodoo.
Hmm.
And, it was a very different ecosystem, if you will, for music journalism and music at that time. And so, the record companies would send hundreds of CDs a month to Pop Matters. Pop Matters would reach out to his writers and say, which one of these that you would want to review. And so I reviewed probably about 300 pieces for Pop Matters between 1999 and 2005, largely album reviews, generally running about 800 words. Some of that stuff is still in their archive. And so I just decided, and a lot of it was me reviewing rhythm and blues music, R&B music, some hip hop, some soul reissues, but really contemporary R&B. And so I took the best of those that I felt and collected them and put them in a collection, right? Songs in the Key of Black Life, Rhythm and Blues Nation.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, that's an expansive writing that you've got there, all those reviews. Well, go ahead.
No, it was fun. I can remember, it's not quite pre-internet, right? But it's at a period of time where, you couldn't find internet in Starbucks.
Right.
And there was no social media, right? So the ability to just pay attention to these CDs coming in without having these other kind of disruptions, it was just different. And I would literally get CDs in and spend, sometimes a week listening to them over and over again. The kind of things that, we don't expect music journalists to do anymore. But, and very often it would force me to go into the archive and listen to some of the other music by an artist, so I could write a more complete story about what album A represents now in relationship to, previous work. And I love that period of time of writing. It was just so much fun.
Yeah, great. So, you and I grew up 600 miles apart from each other, but it appears to me that we had parallel lives because I'm here in Detroit and you were in the Bronx, from my understanding.
Mm-hmm.
And you and I both were unique in our growing up and in our listening habits, based on what I've learned from, again, stalking you on the internet. You had Todd Rundgren as your as your anti pigeonhole music, I should say. Mine was Don McLean, American Pie.
American Pie.
Yeah. I drove my sisters crazy with that song because they like, he's singing that song again.
It's funny. When we take family trips now, whoever drive takes care of the playlist. So I have this playlist called Chuck Leonard. And Chuck Leonard, as you probably know, was a DJ in New York, a black DJ who was on WABC. It was much later in his career I actually figured out that he was black because he didn't sound black, right? But I was in this household where my mother is going through all the Inez Andrews, and Aretha Franklin, and Al Green. My dad is a Hammond B3 guy, right? And also loved him some Bobby Blue Bland and B.B. King. And I was trying to chart out my own musical space, and I found a home in listening to WABC radio, pop radio, New York City, mid-1970s. And I heard enough of R&B and soul music, to keep me connected. But then I got exposed to some of this other wonderful music. So when you talk about, Don McLean and groups like Chicago, obviously, I mentioned Todd Rundgren, early Rod Stewart. I mean, it was just a cornucopia of music. And in the same platform that I'm listening to Chicago, I'm also hearing the new music of Earth, Wind, and Fire and things like that. So I always think of that as kind of like a great heyday of pop radio, because everything is so segmented now You go to the R&B station, you go to the 70s rock station, you go to the
Yeah.
yacht rock station.
Yeah.
And I spend a lot of time on the yacht rock station these days.
Yeah.
In the 70s, right, you could tap in and you could hear all of this, right,
Right.
coming from the same studio.
Yeah. So how did you not find yourself stuck in another genre? How do you become, not how do you become, but how were you fortunate enough to be non-mono musical?
I think it was just the spirit of the times for me. And my parents, I'm not sure my parents ever sat down and had a conversation that's like, well, music is important to us, so music's going to be important to our child. But it was a big deal for them, right? The house was filled with music, right? We literally had 4 speakers placed all throughout the apartment. One in my parents' bedroom, one in like the kitchen area, 2 in the living room. My parents didn't have a lot of things, but they had invested a great deal in the stereo system, right? So there was music all over the place, and at a very young age, partly because they didn't want me to mess with their stuff. They got me transistor radio when I was young. They got me my own stereo with a record player and an 8-track player, right? So I was able to cultivate largely in privacy by myself, my own music, right? And it was whatever just moved me. And again, the sweet spot for me, we listened to WBLS every morning. That was the drive time, as we're getting ready to go to school and work. So I got that then. But when I was going to bed every night, and this is like a habit that went on for a long part of my life, I always went to bed with the radio on. And my radio station of choice was always WABC, right? So that's really how I developed this diverse palette, if you will, around pop music.
Yeah. So where do you feel about I guess it's the fusion and confusion of R&B, new soul, and soul music? I mean, what's your take on all of these subgenres?
Yeah, I'm not big. Even as I went through that whole thing about rhythm and blues and R&B, I'm not big on labeling, right? Labeling feels like something that record companies do to be able to target, audiences.
Yep.
When I first heard D'Angelo in 1995, I heard an update to Marvin Gaye, right? And not what's going on Marvin Gaye or let's get it on Marvin Gaye, but Trouble Man. Marvin Gaye, right?
Yeah.
When I heard Jill Scott, I heard someone who could sing with the best of the R&B and the soul vocalists that I grew up listening to. I think the one, thing that has been interesting is this kind of coming together of R&B and hip hop. If we think about what Teddy Riley did in the late 1980s, and I'll Be Sure, and those folks with New Jack Swing, which was really to take kind of traditional soul and R&B harmonies and layer them over a harder rhythm and beat, right? Something that then sounds like hip hop, by the time we get to Mary J. Blige. I was a fan of that, right? Because as long as the singing was still the singing, it was something that was recognizable to me, no matter what the bottom was.
Yeah.
And I've always appreciated, some producers have been heavy-handed with sampling, but I always appreciated sampling because sampling was a way to keep the archive alive. So that if you hear a really smart sample of contemporary R&B or hip hop song, there's always the original that's there, and particularly for younger audiences, it's a chance to be able to be introduced to this existing music that existed prior to your contemporary artists, your favorite artist doing something with it. We're old enough to be at that age where we already very often had a relationship with the original song before it gets sampled.
Yeah.
Which is a whole, for me, it brings another layer of richness, to listening to it.
So you spoke of young people today. And the advantage that we have and will always have, apparently, well, maybe not, it looks like in the future, vinyl seems to be making a comeback. But you and I grew up with the privilege of having liner notes. I mean, people talk about the artwork on vinyl, but we've got the liner notes. And I talk about YouTube rabbit hole. what do you think about discovering all of the artists on Billy Joel's 52nd Street who were jazz heads? I mean, that kind of thing just blew me away.
When I was a teenager and in college, I had a summer job in New York downtown, and we get paid in cash. I worked at a stationery warehouse, and I'd take my cash and walk from the Astor Place area all the way down to Lower Manhattan, and I'd go to this record store called Bondi's, and another one called J&R Music World, and I'd buy albums. And I'd have 4 or 5 albums a week I would buy. I'd buy some new cassette tapes to make the new mixtape with the new music. And on the long train ride back up to the Bronx, I would open up the albums and study the liner notes. It's the way that I get introduced, for instance, right? When I see Marcus Miller's name on both a Luther Vandross album and also a David Sanborn album, I'm like, okay, this is somebody I probably need to pay attention to, right? And so you dig deeper, right? When I see, names like Lenny White, when I see the jazz artists that played on Sting's first album, that it was important to make those kind of connections, particularly when you start to see the same names show up over and over again, right? When I realized who the Crusaders were, and I'm listening to, Joe Sample's solo work and Wilton Felder's solo work. And I realized that Wilton Felder played on Marvin Gaye's Let's Get It On album, right? Except he didn't play the saxophone on that album. He played the bass. And it's like, whoa, I didn't even know he played. No, it was part of my education, right? To know who was on these albums, to start recognizing producers. Right. So then you begin to recognize the sound, because like with Marcus Miller, it's not just that he's a bass player, right? But he's also this extraordinary producer. So that when I hear Marcus Miller is producing Miles Davis's new album, Tutu, right, I know I need to go get that album.
Right. Yeah. So what do you think about the international, global R&B community when you've got Korean soul or Korean R&B artists? I mean, Japanese, scene where it's heavy soul and R&B. What do you think about the community expanding like that?
I think it's important. Black music is one of America's great exports, to the world.
Yeah.
And the thing that is always important to me about R&B music, rhythm and blues, is that, more than any other musical genre in Black America, R&B is working class Black music, right? It's the music that your rank and file Black people listen to, have a relationship with, right? They might not like jazz. They might feel that the blues is a little too much. They might not ever get into, hip hop music, but R&B is like that sustenance, right? It's like slow cooked Blackness, for lack of a better way to describe it. And so for the fact that that's now out in the world and there are folks who are showing appreciation for it, for me, it's just important. It's obviously great for individual artists because they no longer have to rely on the American market and radio stations and satellite radio and all those and hoping that, your music shows up in some sort of algorithm, that sort of folks are introduced to it, that there's a larger world and a larger audience for their music.
I've often thought about, trying to figure out a way for, National Endowment of Arts to, throw some money behind a national delegation, across America to introduce everybody to all these different genres. Because have I not started this podcast, I would have left off at least one significant genre from the Black community, Zydeco. Yeah. I thought the last genre of music was Zouk. And I talked to some people about Zydeco, and I was blown away. I'm a kid that grew up in the Midwest, and I'm not sheltered, but I grew up in the Midwest, and I kind of didn't know anything about this thing in East Texas or in Louisiana. So how about you, with all your connections, head up against the delegation and make this thing happen?
And that's part of the challenge, right? Because, R&B as one example, but so many genres of Black music just simply never had the stature of, jazz music and other forms of Black music that have been treated as kind of, classic forms of music. And so we haven't done a great job caretaking some of that music, curating, the greatness of that music. So I think your idea is dead on. Let's get some people out there to record some of these artists, to do interviews with them, to create playlists, right? So more folks can find out about these traditions.
Yeah, yeah. So now I asked you, I don't know if you had the opportunity to do it, but I asked you whether or not you could come up with some talking music for people who you met at a dinner club and they've been under a rock or they've been stuck in country mode, and instead of asking them how the weather is, you ask them what's on their playlist. So what do you recommend as a part of the playlist for somebody who's just being introduced to R&B?
So I'll go with albums.
Okay.
I think Luther Vandross's "Give Me the Reason" is such a great album. It's him, his full blown maturity, great ballads, some of his most pop crossover type songs. So I would start there. Cheryl Lynn's "Instant Love" album, which of course, Luther is on. And so it gives you an introduction to that Marvin Tammy feel without having to go back to the 1960s. Rick James's "Street Songs," the best example of R&B attempting to be in touch with what was happening in the world. It's interesting to think about the fact, for instance, that "Street Songs" comes out 2 years before "The Message." And we often think about "The Message" as like ground zero for, social commentary and rap music. And I can't imagine that the members of Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five didn't spend quality time with that Rick James album, as a kind of influence. I'm a big fan of the SOS Band. So anything from that period, Just Be Good to Me, I think is just an extraordinary track. I mean, the whole 9-minute version of it, it's Jam and Lewis is coming out as producers. There's something majestic about the introduction of the song. I mean, it's just extraordinary, right? But you could also add things like, Tell Me If You Still Care in that mix. I would find Atlantic Star. I would go earlier in terms of some of their work. So stuff like Circles, before they cross over and become popular with like Secret Lover or, Touch of 4-Leaf Clover, some of that early 80s R&B of theirs. Speaking of stars, Midnight Star, Curious, which is just one of my sweet spots, from 80s R&B, right? So I would start there.
Yeah, thanks for that list of you. So, like I say, I kind of hinted that you were well connected. So how does an academic guy get involved? Well, it's obvious you get involved with the Smithsonian because of the academics. But how did you luck up and get into this CD that they're putting out for this pre-sale now and available in August? How did you? Tell me the story.
I was fortunate. And so really the two people that are behind pulling this together, it was a vision that came out of a collaboration with Chuck D and Timothy Ann Burnside, who works at the Smithsonian. And I had been part of a project that Timothy Ann worked on back in 2006 on the Apollo Theater. So that's at least how she knew me. And Chuck began the process, in that period of time of giving paraphernalia from the Public Enemy to Timothy Ann with the idea that, it would end up as a hip hop exhibition at the Smithsonian. And this is really before the public knows anything about the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And they brought, Chuck began to put together a list of names of folks that they would like to work on this project. And so we came together for the first time in 2014, 2 years before the museum launch. I remember meeting Lonnie Bunch for the first time and him showing us the kind of model of what the museum was going to look like. And so it was, folks like myself and MC Light was there and Jeff Chang was there, Timothy Ann, Chuck D, Ninth Wonder was involved. It was a great opportunity. My colleague Cheryl Keys, who teaches out at UCLA, and it was an opportunity to bring together industry folks who have been involved in the process, academics and scholars and journalists, and let's literally, I can still remember these conversations. We got to come up with 100-something songs over the course of 50 years. There aren't going to be any doubles, right? We can't include some folks, so maybe we include them in collaboration. And we settled on these 109 songs over these 9 CDs. And this incredible booklet that includes essays. And it's been a long while in the making. There once was a time we thought it would be available, the opening of the museum. So, it took a while. It might be a little late, but of course it's still right on time.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Because I, being here in Detroit, and we have the, Motown Museum. And I talk to people about that, and I've had a gentleman on, and he's written a book about Motown, the sound, and he and I kind of got amazed by the fact that Berry Gordy's sister had a wherewithal back then to save stuff, just to curate, and she has business cards from the early days, in that museum. So I appreciate, Brother Lonnie doing what he does. And I saw him on an interview not too long ago where he's saying now he has this, I forgot what kind of team he called it. But basically it's a group of people who are ready to act on something as significant as what happened on January 6th. They were in there collecting things from that incident for that day for the museum.
Right. I know there were great examples of them doing that around Black Lives Matter. Right. As soon as things would happen, right, they would make sure they could find as many things to recover and collect from the moment.
Yeah. Yeah. That's just fascinating. I mean, I've been in that museum at least 5 times. And again, it's an amazing experience. Yeah.
It is. Right. And you still feel as though you didn't get to see it all. Get to spend enough time with what you did see.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Yeah. Because every time I go in there, it's a minimum 2 days for me. Because I'm always bringing somebody along with me. I'm like being the shepherd. Follow me. And check this out. You've got to experience this. So yeah. So all right. Well, you know what? I think we have covered enough here. Do you have anything coming up here in the near future?
My new book, Black Ephemera: The Crisis and the Challenge of the Musical Archive, will be released in the spring of 2022. So I'm really excited about that. I got a chance to write about Stax, particularly the Al Bell era Stax. I got a chance to write about Marvin Gaye and Aretha Franklin and their different versions of the Great American Songbook. So it's a lot about talking about the ways in which it's important to continue to maintain and curate, the archive of Black music.
Well, Dr. Mark Anthony Neal, thank you again for accepting our invitation to Meet the Music. Thank you for sharing all you know, and we appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Thomas.
That was a fun conversation. I actually knew it was going to be pretty exciting because I stumbled upon someone like me who was not monomusical at a young age. It is a small club. I want to thank Dr. Mark Anthony Neal for sharing some classic R&B artists and their music. I hope you gain a new perspective on the R&B genre. I'm actually going to listen to SOS Band for a different year now. Please be sure to visit Dr. Neal's Amazon page and hit the follow button so you can get notification when his new book is available in 2022. As always, please share the link to this episode and your favorite episode with someone who wants to expand their playlist. They can listen directly from our website, meetthemusic.buzzsprout.com, or wherever they get their podcasts. If this was your first episode, be sure to listen to our most downloaded episode on Zydeco with Michael Tesserand, or start at the beginning of this series with Dr. Raylan Rabaka on rap and hip-hop culture. Thank you for joining us on our musical journey. Remember, if it's Monday, it's Meet the Music.